You walk into an open house on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The place is listed at $499,000. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, updated kitchen, decent yard. Nothing flashy, but clean. Move-in ready. You stand in the living room, imagining your couch against that wall, your coffee table in front of the window. The realtor is smiling. The mortgage calculator on your phone says the monthly payment would be around $3,200 with 10% down. You're making $120,000 a year. You think to yourself, I can afford this. But here's the question almost no one asks in that moment. Can you actually afford it? Or does the math just barely clear? Because those are not the same thing. Most people confuse qualifying for a loan with being able to afford the asset. The bank will approve you. The numbers will technically work. You'll get the keys. But what the bank cares about is whether you can make the payments without defaulting. What you should care about is whether buying that home moves you closer to financial freedom or quietly locks you into a decade of paycheck dependency, lifestyle restriction, and zero room for error. The gap between those two realities is where most wealth gets lost. So let's actually run the numbers. Not the numbers your lender shows you. Not the aspirational budget you tell yourself you'll stick to. The real numbers. The ones that include property tax, insurance, maintenance, the opportunity cost of your down payment, and the lifestyle you'll actually live once you move in. Because if you're serious about building wealth, you need to know the difference between affording a $500,000 home and truly being able to carry one without sacrificing the financial optionality that matters more than the house itself. Let's start with the surface math. A $500,000 home with 10% down means you're financing $450,000. At a 7% interest rate, your principal and interest payment is about $2,990 per month. Add property tax at 1.2% annually, which is $6,000 a year or $500 a month. Homeowners insurance runs around $150 a month. HO fees, if applicable, might add another $200. So now you're at $3,840 per month before you fixed a single broken appliance or paid a single utility bill. Lenders typically use a debt-to-income ratio of 43% as the upper limit for mortgage approval. If you're making $120,000 a year, that's $10,000 a month gross, or about $7,200 after taxes in a moderate tax state. 43% of your gross income is $4,300. You're at $3,840 in housing costs alone, so technically, you qualify. You're under the threshold. The bank says yes. But let's keep going. You still have a car payment, let's say $450 a month. Student loans, maybe $300. Health insurance, if you're self-employed or your employer doesn't cover it fully, another $400. That's $1,150 in additional fixed costs. Now you're at $4,990 per month in obligations before groceries, gas, internet, phone, or saving a single dollar. You're taking home $7,200. You're spending $4,990 on fixed costs. That leaves $2,210 for everything else. Food for a household might run $800. Gas and car maintenance $250. Utilities $200. Phone and internet $150. Subscriptions $100. That's $1,500. You're left with $710 a month in discretionary income. $710. That's your margin. That's your buffer against unexpected expenses, your capacity to invest, your ability to save for the next down payment, your retirement contributions, your emergency fund replenishment after you drain it for the closing costs and moving expenses. That's the space between surviving the purchase and actually building wealth after it. And here's the part most people don't admit until years later. That margin disappears fast, because once you move into the $500,000 house, your lifestyle expands to fit it. You buy furniture that actually fills the rooms. You upgrade your lawn equipment. You host people, so you stock the bar and the pantry differently. You drive a little further to work, so gas costs creep up. The HOA sends you a violation notice about your fence, and now you're spending $1,200 you didn't plan for. The HVAC system is 12 years old, and it dies in July. That's another $6,000. These aren't freak accidents. They're the operating costs of ownership. The $710 buffer gets eaten month after month until you're running at break-even or worse. And break-even is not wealth. Break-even is fragility disguised as success. Now let's compare that to someone making the same $120,000, but who chooses to rent a comparable home for $2,400 a month or buy a $350,000 home instead. The renter pays $2,400, has no maintenance costs, no property tax, no surprise capital expenditures. Their monthly obligation is fixed and predictable. That leaves them $4,800 a month after rent and the same fixed debts. They can save $2,000 a month, invested at an average 8% annual return, and in 10 years they'll have around $370,000 in liquid invested capital. That's optionality. That's leverage. That's the ability to buy the $500,000 house later with cash, or to never buy it at all because the invested capital is generating passive income that exceeds what homeownership would have provided. The person who bought the $350,000 home finances $315,000 at 7%, which is about $2,095 a month. Add $350 in taxes, $125 in insurance, and you're at $205,170. They're saving $1,270 per month compared to the $500,000 buyer. Over 10 years invested at 8%, that difference compounds to about $233,000. Same income, different house, $250,000 in divergence. And that's before we talk about opportunity cost. When you put $50,000 down on that $500,000 house, that money is no longer working for you in the market. If you had invested that $50,000 instead, earning 8% annually, it would grow to about $108,000 in 10 years. The house might appreciate, sure. Let's say it grows at 3% per year, which is roughly in line with long-term averages. In 10 years, it's worth $672,000. You've gained $172,000 in equity from appreciation, but you've also paid down about $60,000 in principal over that time. So your total equity is around $282,000. Sounds good until you subtract what you could have made by investing. You gave up $58,000 in potential investment growth on the down payment. You gave up another $233,000 by buying the bigger house instead of the smaller one. That's $291,000 in foregone compounding. Your $282,000 in home equity cost you $291,000 in opportunity. You didn't build wealth. You traded it. And that's assuming the market cooperates. If home prices stagnate or drop, if interest rates stay high and you can't refinance, if you need to sell during a downturn, the equity you're counting on evaporates. Meanwhile, the person who invested has liquidity. They can move. They can pivot. They can deploy capital into better opportunities. They have freedom. You have a mortgage. This is not an argument against home ownership. It's an argument against the idea that owning the most expensive home you can technically afford is a wealth-building strategy. It's not. It's a lifestyle decision disguised as an investment. Real affordability isn't about whether you can make the payment. It's about whether the payment leaves you with enough margin to keep building, enough to invest, enough to take risks, enough to say no to the next job you hate because you've got 6 months of expenses saved and a portfolio that's compounding. That's what affording something actually means. The formula is simple. Take your gross income, multiply by 0.28. That's the maximum you should spend on housing if you want to preserve financial flexibility. For someone making $120,000, that's $2,800 a month. If your total housing cost is $3,840, you're overspending by $1,040 every month. That's $12,480 a year. Over 10 years, that's $124,800 in lost savings, or about $190,000 in lost investment value when you account for compounding. But here's what's even more insidious. When you stretch to afford the house, you don't just lose the ability to invest the difference. You lose the ability to take career risks. You can't leave your job to start the business. You can't take the pay cut to switch industries. You can't move to the city with lower costs and better opportunities because you're locked into the mortgage. The house doesn't just cost you money. It costs you optionality. And optionality is the most valuable asset you'll ever own. Let's talk about who can actually afford the $500,000 home without sacrificing their financial future. The math is clean. If you want to keep housing at 28% of gross income and your total housing cost is $3,840 per month, you need to be making $165,000 a year. At that income, you're taking home around $10,000 a month after taxes. $3,840 in housing leaves you $6,160 for everything else. Subtract $1,150 in other fixed debts, $1,500 in living expenses, and you still have $3,510 left over. That's real margin. That's enough to max out your retirement accounts, build an emergency fund, invest in taxable accounts, and still have room to live without constant financial stress. Or, if you're making $120,000, the house you can truly afford is closer to $350,000. That keeps your housing cost around $2,570, leaves you $4,630 after fixed costs and living expenses, and gives you $3,130 a month to deploy toward wealth building. That's $37,560 a year. Invested at 8%, that grows to about $570,000 in 10 years. Add in your home equity from the smaller house, and you're sitting on $850,000 in net worth. Compare that to the person who bought the $500,000 house and has $282,000 in equity and maybe $85,000 saved because they could only put away $710 a month when things went well. The gap is $483,000. Same income, same 10 years, a $500,000 difference in outcome. This is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The house you buy in your 30s determines the wealth you have in your 50s. not because the house itself makes you rich, but because the margin it leaves you determines whether you can invest consistently, whether you can compounding work in your favor, whether you can build the kind of financial foundation that creates actual freedom. And freedom is the entire point. Freedom is what lets you work because you want to, not because you have to. Freedom is what lets you take the sabbatical, move across the country, start the business, retire early, help your kids, donate seriously, live without the constant hum of financial anxiety. The house is just a place to sleep. The margin is what buys your life back. So when you're standing in that open house, looking at the granite countertops and the vaulted ceilings, ask yourself the real question. Not can I make the payment, but does this purchase leave me with enough margin to keep building the life I actually want? Because if the answer is no, then you can't afford it, even if the bank says you can. The wealthiest people I know don't live in the biggest houses they can technically afford. They live in houses that cost 15 to 20% of their gross income, sometimes less. They drive cars that are paid off. They keep their fixed costs low and their optionality high. They look middle class from the outside, but their balance sheets are compounding quietly in the background. They have margin, they have leverage, they have freedom. And the people who look the wealthiest, the ones in the $500,000 starter home at 35, the ones with the new SUV and the driveway and the landscaping service and the kitchen remodel, they're often running at break even. They're one layoff, one medical bill, one bad market away from financial catastrophe. They're not building wealth, they're performing it. This is the trap. The trap is believing that the life you can finance is the life you can afford. It's not. The life you can afford is the one that leaves you with margin. Everything else is just expensive theater. So here's the framework. Before you buy, calculate your true total housing cost. Include principal, interest, taxes, insurance, hoe fees, maintenance, utilities, and an honest buffer for the unexpected. Then divide that by your gross monthly income. If it's over 28%, you're not buying a home. You're buying a liability that will quietly drain your ability to build real wealth. If you're at 28% or below, and you still have enough left over to save 20% of your income, invest consistently, and maintain an emergency fund, then yes, you can afford it. Not because the bank approved you, but because the math leaves you whole. And if the house you want pushes you past that threshold, then the house you want is not the house you can afford, which means you have two choices: make more money or buy a different house. There is no third option that ends in financial freedom. The good news is that this is completely within your control. You can choose the smaller house. You can choose to rent longer. You can choose to prioritize margin over square footage. And when you do, you're not settling. You're investing in optionality. You're buying time. You're building the foundation that will let you buy the bigger house later with cash, or decide you never needed it in the first place because the wealth you built gave you something better. That's the real answer to the question. Who can afford a $500,000 home in 2026? Someone making $165,000 or more who keeps their other costs reasonable, or someone making $120,000 who buys the $350,000 house instead and invests the difference. Everyone else is just renting their life from the bank and calling it ownership. So the next time you're standing in that open house, calculator in hand, thinking about what you can afford, remember this: the question isn't whether you can make the payment. The question is whether making the payment still leaves you free. Because if it doesn't, you're not buying a home. You're buying a very expensive trap. And the cost of that trap isn't just money. It's the next 10 years of your life. Choose margin. Choose optionality. Choose freedom. The house will still be there when you can actually afford it.